polygamy. Verse 18 says, do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife and have sexual relations with her while your wife is living. So that doesn't specifically say the word polygamy. We don't have that word actually in the Bible. But, okay, so here's a question. Does the Bible condone polygamy? No. Does the Bible outright say polygamy is wrong? No, it doesn't. So polygamy is the idea of taking multiple wives or multiple husbands, right? Is having more than one wife or more than one husband at the same time. So I just want to pause and just dive into this a little bit and explain. So whenever we study the Bible, we have to look at the context of its day and understand the why that is there for the context of the day, and then ask, how should we respond to that for us today? So when we look at polygamy, do we see it in the Old Testament? Yes, we do see it in the Old Testament. In the patriarchs, Abraham was married to Sarah. It was Abram and Sarai, and then God changed their names to Abraham and Sarah. But then Abraham marries Hagar, right? Why did that happen? Well, that happened because Sarah and Abraham were impatient in waiting for God's promise for them to have descendants, right? God made the Abrahamic covenant and said, I will make you a mighty nation. If you can count the stars, you will be able to count your descendants. If you can count the sand on the seashore, you'll be able to count your descendants. And Abraham's like, yeah, see, I don't have any kids, so how's that going to happen? And so we do see in Genesis 16, where we see a glimpse into the culture of the day. If you could not have children through your first wife, it was a culturally acceptable practice to marry one of your wife's handmaidens or take on an additional wife so that you can have children. We also see this with Jacob, right? Now, Jacob's situation is slightly different. He went to marry to marry Rachel. Rachel was the one that he loved, and he worked 7 years for her, and then Rachel's father, Laban, pulls a fast one on him and swaps Leah, Rachel's older sister, so that Jacob ends up marrying Leah, and then Laban makes an agreement that if you'll work another 7 years, you can also be married to Rachel. So then he's forced to be married to two wives, but again, culturally speaking, this wasn't out of the norm. And the reason being is because of how important children were for everything, for taking on your family line, but also everything is agriculture, everything is farming, everything is taking care of the livestock, and you need children to be able to do this. You need population to be able to do these elements. And so if you cannot have children with this wife, then you would take on another wife. And then we also do see Bilhah and Zilpah, Genesis 29 and 30 are where we see this. And those are both the handmaidens of Leah and Rachel. All this is done so that Jacob can have the many descendants. Now, we also do see King David and King Solomon have multiple wives. King Solomon, we learned from 1 Kings 11:3, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. In that exact same verse, 1 Kings 11:3, it concludes with, his wives led him astray. The fall of Solomon was polygamy. It was him having all of his wives. In fact, every single instance where you see multiple wives, you also see frustration and strife. So the examples that we do have in our Bible of situations where you have multiple spouses are not a good example of, oh, well, that ended well, let's go and do the same thing. Genesis 2:24. A man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Genesis 2, the second chapter in our Bible, clearly establishes God's design for mankind. One man, one woman, united in marriage. That's it. That's the design God had. Now, let's look at the New Testament, right? I forgot. I also need to add Exodus 21:10, Deuteronomy 21:15 through 17, Leviticus 18:18, which is where we're at, All of these include discussions on polygamy with regulations for it. Okay, so I did want to be honest to the text. Those three do give regulations. They don't say it's okay, but they don't say it's outlawed. So what does the New Testament say? Well, Jesus had some very specific things to say on this. So leave a marker here in Leviticus 18 and flip with me to Matthew 5. Matthew 5 is the, excuse me. It's not Matthew 5. It's Matthew 19. So Matthew 19, I was looking down at our next text, which is from Ephesians 5. So Matthew 19, Jesus is questioned about divorce, and we're going to read verses 1 through 9. When Jesus finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Verse 3, some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? This is Jesus' response. Verse 4, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Jesus is quoting from Genesis 2, and he adds, therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. What is the definition of adultery? Anything that goes outside of Genesis 2. One man, one woman coming together in one flesh in the confines of marriage. Anything outside of that is considered adultery. And we'll mention it in just a minute when we talked about sexual immorality. We'll talk about it a bit more. But Ephesians 5, 25 through 33, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her. You notice that it's singular, just like Matthew 19, it's always singular. Cleansing her by the washing in water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the church, for we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Verse 32, this is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife and as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Singular. It's all singular. 1 Timothy 3:2, as well as Titus 1:6. This is a call when you're looking for leaders, elders, deacons. What are the traits of an elder or deacon or a pastor that they should have? 1 Timothy 3:2. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach. Titus 1:6, an elder must be blameless, faithful to his wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. It's singular. It's singular in all these. And then 1 Corinthians 7:2, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. Singular. We'll talk about sexual immorality here in just a second, but the Old Testament does show examples of polygamy, of a man married to multiple women. It doesn't paint them in a positive light. And in the New Testament, it clearly sets up the standard based on Genesis 2:24. Genesis 2:24, at the very beginning, God sets his standard. Then Jesus clearly stamps his approval on that standard. So when you look from Genesis to Revelation, anybody who says, oh, the Bible supports polygamy, if you read it in the context of the whole book, it doesn't. It does not come straight out and say that it is wrong, and it doesn't come straight out and say that it is okay. But if you look at the words that Jesus says and you look at Genesis 2, the context is pretty obvious that it's not a good thing and it doesn't lead to good. That's it on polygamy. You got to decide for yourself. Monogamy is clearly what God's design is. Okay, going back to Leviticus, we jump from one enjoyable subject to another.
This has been a production of Iron Sheep Ministries.